Right, think of an important historical date. Have you thought of one? Was it 1066, the date of the Battle of Hastings, which kicked off the Norman Conquest? I thought it might be. The fact that this date is so burnt into our minds shows that somehow we believe that this country changed overnight at that time from being some sort of Anglo-Saxon Celtic place to being sort of French. But what impact did the Norman invasion actually have? Did everything change just like that? Time Team's dug loads of sites from that period, and now we've put the best of them together to see if we can answer those questions. The Normans didn't build forts, they built castles, and many of them survive today. This one at Alderton in Northamptonshire was bought by Derek Batten, who knew little of its history. I reckon you've been conned.
No, he hasn't.
There's no castle, it's just a little hill.
It's very definitely what we'd expect for a Norman castle. You can see it's under the trees, but you can see the moat, and the rest of it is hidden under the trees.
What sort of castle is it?
Well, I think it's probably a ringwork.
Is that what we call a Motte and Bailey?
No, if you come and look at Victor's drawings, look, you can see the sort of two basic types of Norman castle. This is the Motte and Bailey, look, with a big mound with a timber tower on the top, and around the bottom one or more baileys which have got the domestic buildings in, whereas a ringwork is a much more flattened mound with all the buildings on the top.
So are we going to be looking for the remains of buildings up there somewhere?
Yeah, we're going to be looking on the top, and we're going to be looking at the bank and ditch, because they'll tell us something about when it was built.
The first of our trenches went in across the defensive ditch around the castle. We were looking for evidence to date it.
3 days to do it.
Phil! How's this trench going?
Very, very well, actually, Tony. We've already got through the main disturbance, the recent disturbance, and we're already into ditch fills, and mainly we've actually got medieval pottery.
Oh, right.
In the interior of the castle, we opened a second trench across an earthwork where there could have been a central building. While a short distance away, digging also started on the rampart. We began on the easy side to give us a bit of time to consider the challenge of this side. Derek Batten had found pottery dating from 200 BC, so this site had quite a history.
We start up here. We're in the late Iron Age, around about 200, 100 BC.
Gosh.
We moved to this piece. It's probably a base of a big storage vessel. We moved to this piece. It's what you'd call Belgic, or what used to be called Belgic, late Iron Age into early Roman, say 50 AD. We come down the bottom, and now we're into the Saxon period. This little piece is early or Middle Saxon.
When you say early to Middle Saxon, what sort of dates are you talking about?
450 to 850 AD.
Really?
Derek's collection included medieval pottery and roof tile belonging to a building that was here in the 14th or early 15th century. Stuart, our landscape investigator, was convinced that when the Normans arrived, they took over an earlier fort.
It's almost triangular.
Yeah.
It's got this very pronounced curve round here, and yet it's got this very straight side along here.
I quite agree. I can't see any reason on the ground why that should turn through that immensely sharp angle more than a right angle.
Mm-hmm.
Stuart thought the original ditch enclosed the top of the hill like this, and may have been an Iron Age fort or a Saxon defended site called a burg. The Normans simply used one end of the enclosure, resulting in a castle looking something like this. Our experts thought its sheer size meant that it was built very soon after the Norman invasion. But were there any records?
By 1086, William the Conqueror had granted the manor to his half-brother, Robert, Count of Mortain, who became almost overnight after the conquest the wealthiest landowner in England, bar the king and the church.
So you reckon this Robert,
Count of Mortain,
could probably have built the castle?
I think it's most likely. He was a prominent Norman baron, and he was the kind of person who needed to keep his thumb on the newly conquered population, who were ready to revolt at a moment's notice.
Slowly, our trenches started to reveal how the castle had developed. In the rampart trench, we thought we'd found evidence of the original structure.
Well, I think there's a line of stones across there. There's a darker patch beyond. There are stones like that across there, and they all seem to be part of the construction of the rampart. And that's good, because once they're taken out, we might be able to find out how it's built, and if they left any rubbish behind, we could tell when it was built.
And on our last day, we got that crucial dating evidence in the same trench.
Yeah. And we just found these two sherds of pottery.
Oh, right. Well, this bit's late Saxon, about 900 to 1100. This other piece is a little bit later, 11th, 12th century, thereabouts.
So with these two conflicting dates, it was back to the structure to confirm whether or not this really was Norman.
On this side, it looks from what they've dug that there's a slot across where timber was, more timbers to brace it out, and probably a wooden platform held up by what we've got down there.
So you've got palisade, you've got earth butted right up against it, and then behind that, a walkway, wooden walkway.
That's right.
So we were able to confirm that we were investigating a very early Norman castle. Give us a date.
1070.
Well, we solved that one, haven't we? When the Normans arrived, the old Saxon encampment might have looked like this. While our search for buildings in the middle of the castle was disappointing, the most spectacular evidence we found belonged to the Norman ringwork construction. This shows how it might have looked when it was first built, which we think was only 4 years after the Battle of Hastings. The size of Alderton Castle reflected the status of the man who built it. Robert, Count of Mortain, half-brother to William the Conqueror. Were all castles built to the same kind of design?
Oh, certainly not. One of the things we see when we look at castles is an individuality of design. Each one's different. That's what makes them interesting.
How many would there have been in the heyday of the Normans?
Well, it's very difficult to answer, but we think that in about the 150 years after the conquest, at any one time, there would have been about 400 to 500 castles actually being lived in.
Was this new technology?
Difficult to say. Certainly there's a long tradition of castle building, but this has been improved over the course of the 12th century with new ideas.
Where did they get these new ideas from?
Influence of the Crusades, basically coming from the Arab empires of the East.
Like many Norman castles, Alderton didn't survive much longer than the Normans. It fell into disuse in the 14th century, but another one we excavated survived longer, although it met a rather more dramatic end. There are two parts to the small town of Bridgenorth. The lower town is next to the River Severn, and the upper town sits on an outcrop with commanding views over the Shropshire countryside. On the top of this promontory is a park, and all that's left of the castle is the ruined tower. Robin.
Hi, Denny.
Who was the chap who had this castle built in the first place?
Robert de Bellême, who subsequently became Earl of Shrewsbury.
And what do we know about him?
Well, I have to say, I've had many unpleasant characters on Time Team over the years. I think he takes the biscuit as the nastiest I've ever come across.
Why? What did he do?
He tended to take captives and refuse to ransom them so that he could have the pleasure of torturing them to death. He would impale men and women on hooks. He starved 300 prisoners to death over Lent. And the worst thing of all was, he had as a hostage his godson, a little lad. And because the child's father had displeased him, he gouged out his eyes with his own bare fingernails. That's the kind of person he was.
In the 12th century, Robert de Bellême's castle consisted of a series of defensive walls and ditches around the central tower or keep, which is still standing, or only just. Our castle's expert Philip Dixon worked out how it had fitted into the remaining defences around.
This is the remains of a wall.
Yeah.
Sloping down there and here. This is the first bit of the castle.
How do you know that's the first bit?
Because of the way in which this, which is the keep, has been built over the top of it.
That's that line I can see going right the way up there.
That's right. So this is the first phase.
Right.
And this is second.
Because it's butted up against
Because it's butted up. And the keep runs all the way over the top. And that's second. And then we've got a third stage.
Yeah.
And the third stage is the wall here. And that's not butted up against the keep, it's just standing beside it. And it's the forebuilding, the staircase that got you into the tower.
Can you put any sort of dates on these phases from what you can see?
Well, that could be Robert of Bellême.
What could be?
One.
This wall.
So we have 1100, 1120, 1160.
So Robert de Bellême built the original castle of stone. But the tower didn't exist until about 1120 and was built over the existing inner bailey wall. The original staircase into the tower would have been wooden and removable, until 1160, when the final phase of the tower was complete, with a fixed stairway and gatehouse.
So we're right round the other side now.
That's right. And here's a bit of wall, the same date as the keep,
Yeah.
coming out,
How do we know it's the same date as the keep?
because all the stone lines run through. It's bonded in.
It's bonded into the keep itself, right?
That's right. And here we've got a groove coming right up, and that's a portcullis groove.
So this is where the grill would have come down over an entrance.
That's right. A great arch coming out this way.
Right, right. It's very narrow, though,
It
isn't
is narrow because it's a metal portcullis, which is the most expensive sort, an iron portcullis.
So which way is it defending then?
Well, this is the outside, and this is the inside.
So this is the area where the royal apartments are, then, in here?
In this area over here.
Right.
Through Philip's analysis, we now knew the area where the king's house would have been, and that a wall with an iron portcullis gateway would have protected it. Excavation in the park helped us locate the outer wall and ditch. But how did the tower end up at such a crazy angle? And why did the rest disappear? The answer could be found 500 years later during the English Civil War. In 1646, the parliamentarians laid siege to it.
Prepare to give fire! Have a care! Give fire!
Oh, I think we've missed.
Have a care! Give fire!
The last siege at Bridgenorth in 1646 lasted for 3 weeks, with the Royalists returning as much firepower from within the castle as they received. This brought the battle to a stalemate, which led the parliamentarians to come up with a ruse to ensure surrender of the castle. To explain what this plan was, Robin took me to Lavington's Hole, a small cave hidden away at the foot of a cliff on the far side of the promontory.
But in the end, they decided to dig this tunnel to sap up underneath the church, pack it full of gunpowder, and blow the whole thing sky high.
Well, that sounds a more effective use of gunpowder.
Up in the castle, the Royalists could hear the noise of the tunnelling, and they got the message that unless they surrendered, the gunpowder would be packed in, and all the munitions stored in the church above, along with all the cavaliers, would get blown sky high. That was enough. That was enough to bluff them into surrendering.
So how did the tower get like this if it wasn't blasted from here?
Well, we'll go up topside and I'll show you. Once the cavaliers had surrendered, the Roundheads couldn't leave the castle here as a kind of symbol of royalty, as a focus for further uprising. So, you stay here. They dug a big hole underneath this tower, and they packed it absolutely full of gunpowder and laid kegs all around it. And then, well, let me show you.
Let's do. Robin's completely mad. Kings didn't get it all their own way in the early Middle Ages. They may have won the battles, but they needed the power of the church right behind them. And unfortunately, being right behind someone is a pretty good place to do a bit of backstabbing. The church had its own power base among the increasingly powerful monasteries. And over the years, Time teams had a look at some of the most intriguing of them. The pupils of this Norfolk grammar school think it's rather special, and I've got to say, they may be right. It's not everyone who's got this kind of stuff in their playground. These walls are the remains of a monastic church that stood here 600 years ago, but that's modern compared with what they think is underneath. The school had always claimed that beneath their grounds in Thetford lay the first Norman cathedral in East Anglia, and they wanted us to find it.
Seriously, it is.
If we don't, we just move the pegs.
2 metres.
Meg!
Yeah, yeah?
We started by looking at these medieval church walls in the middle of the school playground.
We might then extend this one across
They'd
here.
probably been part of a 14th century Dominican friary church. And Mick was interested because he thought it might have been built on top of the cathedral. To test his theory, he decided to put in 2 trenches, one up against each wall. If he was right, then the Norman foundations would be just underneath. Only inches from the surface, we hit what looked like the friary wall.
16th century.
And there were lots of finds, including what might have been the remains of one of the Dominican friars.
That's a kneecap. That's part of somebody's knee.
If I found things like this, it'd come to a really big surprise, but you seem really sort of not surprised that you found all these really old things.
Well, you see that most of this stuff is only probably 200 or 300 years old, if that. And what we're hoping to find is stuff that's a lot older. So what it's telling us is that we need to keep digging.
Yeah.
Using Victor's impression of the 14th century church, Beric Morley was able to show me which parts of the building were still standing here.
This end wall is that one.
This over here?
Yep. We're on the inside, of course, so you're looking at it there.
Right. That's this wall here, yep.
The aisle is coming down here, and this is the central nave.
Yeah.
Right the way through there. Now, we haven't got the columns that supported the nave, but fortunately we've got these blind arches here which echo the arches of the nave inside. And there are 5 of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in there.
So 5 would bring us to just before this tower, yeah?
That's right. So that's the wall, effectively, where the wall was at the east end of the nave.
Yeah. On the far side of that building, Carenza had opened up a new trench. She found plenty of evidence of the 14th century friary, if not the cathedral. She uncovered some flint facing, a medieval stone buttress, a floor level, and some very rare medieval window glass. The Children's Timeline project showed that Thetford was a cathedral city for only a very short time, just 23 years. Why then did the first Bishop Herfast bother to build a cathedral here at all? And it seemed ominous that Stuart, who's usually a surveyor, had teamed up with the historians.
Ingressi sunt ecclesiam anti...
It says here that Herfast had no intention of remaining long in Thetford when
I wonder what the cathedral was actually like, really, what it was made out of.
The cathedral did not, it seems, belong to the bishop, but was, as the Norwich Chronicle...
Where the monks lived, they were made of woodwork.
We need a meeting because Stuart has come up with a theory.
Because the Bishop Herfast moved here in 1071 and the cathedral was established, there is this perception we're looking for a Norman cathedral, whereas in fact the evidence seems to be pointing out to him coming here and just using Thetford as a staging post to grab Bury St Edmunds, where the real commercial wealth is and the growth is at this time. And there seems to be lots of documentary evidence which is pointing in towards that.
Historically, maybe we can't resolve it, but archaeologically we might be able to. I mean, you're none of you saying that the centre of the sea wasn't here. There was a building that was used as a cathedral, and archaeology maybe is the only way that's going to tell us whether it's a Saxon building or a Norman building.
I don't have any problem with what you said. I mean, I don't care, quite honestly, whether it's a Saxon building taken over or he built a new one, you know. Which is
we actually don't know that the Anglo-Saxon church is in stone.
No.
And it could just be a timber church. The bishop's seat at Elmham was a timber building.
But at what date, though?
At 1071, when he moves here.
It was still timber?
It's still timber.
But the archaeologists desperately wanted some proof. They focused their search in the area where Carenza had started digging, but a substantial medieval wall turned out again to be from the 14th century friary. So it looked as if Stuart and the historians were right. Bishop Herfast's cathedral at Thetford had been no more than a small Saxon church that was probably made of wood, which explained why we couldn't find it. But later that evening, Phil and Carenza were still searching. Phil, how are you getting on?
Oh, pretty well actually, Tony. We've really got right down here at a really black, rich, organic level, which we think is probably the floodplain.
Great.
But
we've gone right down to the floodplain and we still haven't found the cathedral.
There's no building evidence in there.
John, how are you going to explain this to your Board of Governors?
Well, no, I think the important thing is that we've been looking for the truth about the site, the archaeological truth, and that's been well worth doing. I think the Board of Governors will be pleased, I think, absolutely.
You'll take them on?
Absolutely. I've still got a job, yes.
The Normans have a great reputation as church builders, and what we see after the conquest are cathedrals, monasteries and parish churches all being rebuilt in stone.
Why stone?
Well, I think there are kind of two things here. The first thing, building in stone shows that you have a massive disposable income, but the second point is it's more subtle. It's about permanence. If you're building in stone, you're really sending out a message that you're here and you're here to stay.
Were the Norman churchmen basically doing what the Saxons had done before them, but just on a slightly grander scale?
Yeah, what seems to happen after the conquest is the English church looks more towards Europe and looks towards Normandy. So we see some new procedures introduced after the conquest, but more importantly, the Normans bring their own men with them, and William puts them into church offices.
It's 0900 hours, and Time Team had been called up to investigate a British Army base at Chicksands in Bedfordshire. Before the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century, this was the site of a Gilbertine monastery, founded by St Gilbert less than 100 years after the Norman conquest. So this bit is part of the early monastery, and it's 13th century.
If you look on the air picture, look, we're standing here outside this block here, and you see there's a cloister behind, these buildings behind there.
And the monks and the nuns all lived in this bit?
No, well that's the thing about Gilbertine houses, there's two sets of buildings, one for the canons to live in, one for the nuns. So we've got one cloister, there must be another one somewhere round about. So we've started geophysics off, and hopefully they'll find another cloister with another set of buildings round it.
Mick thought that rather than under this immaculate lawn, the missing nuns' cloister was probably attached to the other side of the church, somewhere in the area of this cobbled courtyard.
Well, I think somewhere in the grass here,
Yeah.
right, somewhere about here,
Yeah.
I reckon. Irrespective of that, I think we should put something in here.
As radar moved in to check out this area, the disappointing news from our first trench on the lawn was that Geophys had only found natural rock. But a second trench next door proved more promising.
We got our wall, we reckon. Look, we got the chalk core there, which is actually going back underneath Ian's feet.
And have you got any finds that go with it?
Yeah, we're getting some really good finds. Window glass.
This one's got paint on it.
Oh, yeah.
That's
So that's fairly
13th
classy.
to 15th century. And
Mick thought this window glass came from the infirmary, which could have been close to the east end of the surviving cloister. I'd always imagined the life of a medieval monk or nun as pretty cushy compared to secular life of the time. Perhaps it was, but not when you look at their daily lives through 21st century eyes.
taking off all your underwear.
I still got my pants on.
That is really bad.
While digging at Chicksands, we asked archaeologist Jenny Butterworth to spend 24 hours as a Gilbertine nun. Having taken a vow of near silence, a Gilbertine's life was all contemplation and prayer. Jenny was trying to get as close as she could to experiencing what life was like for women living at Chicksands 800 years ago.
Can you just dry your hands on the towel?
Lunchtime, normally a chance to relax and overeat.
Thereupon, the king...
But Jenny's meal in our 12th century refectory was accompanied by readings from the Bible.
And this captain, climbing the mountain on which the prophet then dwelt...
She's having pottage, which is a kind of vegetable, barley, kind of thick soup, I suppose. And some very hard bread, very heavy. Historians who've looked at religious women's writings and writings about religious women have actually called this holy anorexia. For women, you really only had these two extreme models. You had Eve, or you had the Virgin Mary. And obviously nuns are trying to be the Virgin Mary and to remove all the sort of aspects of the female body. And fasting to the point of, near starvation and anorexia is one way of doing that.
The nuns' cloister that we were trying to find probably looked something like this. After lunch, Jenny spent an hour and a half learning psalms before going to church, for the first of 8 services that a Gilbertine nun would have attended in a day. I can tell you that she went to bed as instructed at 8:15 and was woken for the first of the night services at 2 a.m.
Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum.
After a half-hour service, Jenny could go back to her straw bed.
Getting up for the 4 in the morning service was when I think my mood changed, because that's when I realised that my day had begun and I wasn't ready for it. By then I was really hungry and I was really tired, and it felt much harder to concentrate and keep my mind on what I was trying to do.
Prayers at 5 a.m, then another service, prime, at 6 a.m. Sewing at 7 a.m. for an hour in the cloister. At 8 o'clock, the nuns attended daily mass.
I must confess that when I was reading the life of St Gilbert this morning, I fell asleep and dropped the book. The chapter meeting really reinforced to me what a strong part discipline played in the life. I really did drop my book sort of very early on in the morning when I was just too tired to stay awake and read. And having confessed to that, I had to lay prostrate on the floor, which seemed incredibly extreme, sort of from a modern point of view, to humiliate somebody in such a physical and public way. And it really is much harder than it looks. I thought it would just be a rest lying down on the floor, but it's really very uncomfortable.
By the end of our digging at Chicksands, we'd uncovered some of the most impressive archaeology I'd ever seen. But what was it all for? Had we found an original 12th century Gilbertine cloister? Or was it the infirmary?
These little half-circular things here.
Well, they're going up to support an arch, going over the top.
Oh, I see. So you've got an arch going up here,
Yeah.
so you've got a building over here, and you've got an arch going up there, so you've got a building over here. Mick's ideas about the remains were based on comparisons with other monastic sites. He believed that what we found was an infirmary, which may have looked like this, similar in layout to Revo in Yorkshire, with a chapel at the east end and its own cloister attached. But this complex of buildings wasn't big enough to be the nuns' cloister. That, as far as most of the team were concerned, was here, which meant that our Gilbertine monastery probably looked like this in the 13th century. About a mile in that direction is Winchester. It's quite a sleepy place today, but it hasn't always been like that. In the 9th century, King Alfred made it his capital, and it remained the top city in Norman England until London finally overtook it. But while Winchester was thriving, not all of its citizens were enjoying the boom. This field lies just outside the city boundaries, and 900 years ago, it was home to a community of Winchester's outcasts. The men who lived here were united by a terrible bond, a disease that disfigured their bodies and condemned them to a life of exile, a disease called leprosy. So somewhere here had been St Mary Magdalene Hospital, one of the largest leper hospitals in medieval England. But there was now no visible trace of it. We wanted to confirm its layout, which reputedly contained almshouses, a master's lodge, and a magnificent chapel. This 18th century plan clearly showed the position of the chapel within the boundary wall. We already knew where the boundary wall was because you could see it faintly on this aerial picture of the site. So we overlaid the plan onto the aerial photo to pinpoint the exact location of the chapel. John, have you got the geophys?
There you are. Cracking geophysics. Absolutely fantastic, isn't it?
Wow.
The whole site laid out. We're just comparing it with the 18th century map, and you can see the church there, which is this block, which is what we're digging over here. And next to that, there's a thing described as the Master's House on this map. And then these two little buildings here are part of this great North Range. But that fits in very nicely with this prospect of the 1770s. And we did think that this range might be a sort of spurious invention, but it's clearly there now as a row of almshouses.
No sooner had we found the remains of a wall, hopefully the chapel in our first trench, than Carenza had opened up another trench to find the end of the building. But we also wanted to find a leper burial to help us establish the position of the lepers' cemetery. We haven't dug this lot up, have we?
No, these are actually from Chichester, from the Leper Hospital Cemetery excavation there.
What is leprosy?
It's a bacterial disease that affects the peripheral nervous system. And because you get a loss of feeling or an anaesthesia associated with that, then you damage your soft tissues, they get infected, and the infection tracks in and actually damages the bone.
So what should our diggers be looking for?
Well, the sorts of things they won't expect to find are a different face. And if we look at this one here, for example, this is a male, and if you look at him, he's actually lost the nasal spine, and the edges here have resorbed and become very round. You've got the bone that supports the teeth here is also pulling back, and so you lose your front teeth as well. How's it coming on then, Victor?
Well, while waiting for her first skeleton to turn up, Margaret was working with Victor on a sculpture to show the facial damage caused by leprosy. The first stage was to build a precise copy of this leper's skull, which was discovered on a previous excavation. The building in trenches 1 and 2 looked promising, but it wasn't a chapel. We knew there was one here because we had these illustrations of the site produced in 1788 before the buildings were demolished. To find out when the hospital was founded, I turned, of course, to Robin.
I've got references from 1148 onwards of varying kinds, and I would push it back slightly to, say, the 1130s, possibly 1140s.
And who founded it?
Well, since we know it was the Bishop of Winchester, that would identify Henry of Blois. Apart from anything else, he was the grandson of William the Conqueror. He became Abbot of Glastonbury, the wealthiest monastery of England, in 1126. And in 1129, he becomes Bishop of Winchester, one of the most valuable bishoprics in England.
Also, I don't know if you can
Very soon, a huge amount of human bone was beginning to turn up in our trenches.
Yeah, that's male, that's flaring nicely there. Yeah, it's interesting.
Margaret?
Yeah?
You've got a minute?
Oh, God.
Can I drag you away?
What have you got now?
I've got another skull.
Oh, my God, look at that. That's fantastic, isn't it?
There's loads more coffin nails again.
So this is a bit strange, isn't it? Because we seem to have two skulls in the same coffin.
We do seem to have two skulls in the same coffin, yeah.
It's a really good condition.
By the end of our 3 days, we did find the chapel, and we were pretty sure we'd also found the almshouses. The style of building was the same as the chapel, and that we knew was 12th century or earlier.
So here we're into the chapel, and you can see that big lump of stone there. That's one of the piers. And then over here, we're right into the centre of the chapel.
Phil Strange?
That's right.
Is that a skull you got there, Phil?
Well, we've actually got at least 2 bodies in here, Tony. It's quite amazing.
It's really interesting. We've got other burials outside the church where Katie is. She's out in the graveyard. And interesting, it's probably where the lepers were buried outside, and the patrons of the whole establishment would be buried in here.
The worst weather we'd ever had forced us to race to tie up as many loose ends as possible before the whole site got washed away.
How many people do you think are actually in there then, Phil?
I believe that for Margaret.
At last a breakthrough, though. We'd found the first evidence of a leper burial.
We can now say that this is a male.
Right.
The pelvis and the skull both indicate that. But although we've got none of the leprous changes to the hands and feet, we actually have got the beginning of remodelling of the nasal bones.
Right.
And so this edge here, which is usually sharp, is actually rounded, and the nasal spine is resorbed.
So he could have been a leper?
He could have been in the early stages of leprosy, yeah.
Over in the incident room, Victor had been hard at work on his bust of a medieval leper. And you could already see the terrible physical impact of the disease. So how were lepers viewed back in the Middle Ages?
You could make the comparison with how people regarded AIDS about 20 years ago. They were very afraid that they might catch it. They thought that the people who had it were repulsive because, of course, leprosy does disfigure you. Also, they associated leprosy with sex. They thought that one of the ways in which it was transmitted was sexually. They thought that lepers were more lustful than ordinary people. And so just as with AIDS, there was this sort of feeling, these are people who've behaved wickedly, and that's why they're like this.
This site was just a bare field when we arrived, but by the end of our dig we'd been able to piece together what the Mary Magdalene Hospital would have looked like just outside medieval Winchester. Inside a boundary wall, we found the chapel and the master's house, the almshouses where the lepers lived, and the cemetery where they were buried. 900 years ago, this would have been one of many communities founded by the church for those who suffered and were judged by the good folk of medieval England. When I was a kid, there was a Robert Louis Stevenson book, I can't remember which one it was, but there's a leper that comes in throughout the whole book, and his head is always covered by this cowl. And I used to wonder what hideous deformities lay underneath. And now, looking at this chap, I realise that it's not just the pustules and the squash nose and the lip. It's the fact that underneath all that, you can still see an unblemished human being looking out of it with those blank, staring eyes. We're going to jump now from hospitals to knights in shining armour. But is it such a leap? Were knights typically great warriors? Or were they perhaps more like the campaigning and charitably inclined Knights Templar? For more than 300 years, the castle of Beaudesert sat on this hill just outside the town of Henley in Arden. Then it disappeared, leaving behind no record of what it looked like in its medieval heyday. Time Team were called in by the locals to investigate their missing castle. The mount is made up of several distinct areas. Geophiz concentrated their efforts here because it was the highest part of the site and the most likely place to find castle buildings. We opened our first trench here. This trench cut across a popular local footpath where the erosion caused by centuries of use revealed a glimpse of masonry which we thought might be part of the castle. And in our second trench, Phil began to uncover clues about what the castle looked like.
Oh yeah, that's glazed floor tile, and that's a roof.
But that's a roof tile, isn't it?
Yeah, it's stone. That's very thick as well. That's a substantial roof. So that's looking very.
Can you
encouraging.
date this stuff?
It's probably around about 14th century. This is probably something a little bit special, hopefully.
Give me that. I want to find some more.
Beaudesert isn't mentioned in the Domesday Book. In fact, the earliest written reference to it is in a medieval charter.
And this is by the Empress Matilda, with the consent of Roger, Earl of Warwick, to Thurston de Montfort, that he shall have a market on Sundays at his castle of Bello Deserto. We know this charter was granted in the spring of 1141. So that castle has to have been built between 1086 and 1141.
In Trench 1, Barney had found the remains of a substantial building. When I came up here first thing this morning, we didn't know if we'd find anything at all, but you certainly seem to have got some structures.
We've got absolutely brilliant stuff. The first thing I should show you is this. Look at the size of that wall. I'm sure that must be something like the curtain wall.
What's curtain wall?
The main defensive wall of the castle.
The entire castle mound would have been surrounded by this massive curtain wall. Barney also discovered the remains of a building next to it. But it seemed unlikely to be the Great Hall, which we expected to find closer to the centre.
And we've had some bits of stone out that are obviously part of the building. You see on this one, you've got tooling marks on that. That's medieval tooling, so that's where it's been squared off. So we've got plenty of building here, lots and lots of roof tile. But there's a few finds coming out which are giving us an idea about sort of daily life in the castle, if you like. We've got pottery of varying sorts, fairly coarse cooking ware, and then much nicer posh tableware, if you like, that green glazed whiteware. So that's your posh tableware. And then in terms of what the castle actually looks like, we've actually got a bit of window glass there. You can just about see through it.
Oh yeah. It seems that the castle developed as the fortunes of the de Montforts grew in the 12th and 13th centuries. But in 1265, the head of the family, Peter de Montfort, was killed at the Battle of Evesham. And like their owners, the buildings went into decline, from which they never recovered. In our first trench across the public footpath, Barney uncovered graphic evidence of the key stages in the life of the castle.
Our 13th century building, our de Montfort period building, is right on top of the demolished remains of a probable Norman high status structure. So we've definitely got two phases here.
Every trench now has produced these two phases.
Yeah.
Early stuff, demolition, and then new buildings on the top. So it's a consistent story right across the site.
And it's the same story uncovered by Robin in the documents. The tale of a powerful family who chose this dramatic hillside to build their stronghold 900 years ago. First they sculpted it to make their castle easier to defend. Then they circled it with a defensive wall. Inside they built private lodgings, servants' quarters and a great hall where they entertained their guests. As the family's fortunes ebbed and flowed, so the castle changed and adapted. Until finally, sometime in the 15th century, the castle on the mount was demolished, leaving behind just a few fragments to remind us of its dramatic history. Templecombe Manor in Somerset. In the 12th and 13th centuries, somewhere near here lived a number of the Knights Templar. We thought this field might have been their administrative centre or preceptory, a base for the Crusades' equivalent of a modern peacekeeping force. There would have been stables, storage buildings and living accommodation for the Templars and their retinue waiting to go out on their campaigns. I know that the Knights Templar were set up in order to protect pilgrims who were on their way to the Holy Land during the time of the Crusades, and they were called the Templars because the two people who started the order lived in the shadow of the temple in Jerusalem. But what the heck were they doing with a big place here in Somerset, which is, after all, a few thousand miles away from Israel?
True. Well, in order to finance their operations, they needed to attract to themselves grants of great estates. They needed little administrative centres from which to collect in the rents and make sure everything was ticking over. And at Templecombe, they planted what they called a preceptory, of which there were many all over the country.
The owner, Jeff Wilson, had bought the manor thinking it was part of the medieval Templar complex.
Oh, I've heard about this. Oh, that's right. Well, look, it curves round at the back.
Our buildings expert, Beric Morley, started with a grand tour of Jeff's home. The house had been modernised repeatedly since the 1600s. Beric's job was to find out if there was anything Templar inside or below the present building. The timber beam and other parts of the house all dated from the 17th century or later, so unfortunately these rooms were built 400 years after the Templars. As well as looking for medieval buildings, we also wanted to locate the line of the boundary wall, which would have originally surrounded the entire Templar precinct.
How you doing there, Mick?
Well, we're a bit out of touch, so
it's looking pretty good, actually.
These are the sort of things that the church would have had all over the floor, and probably some of the other buildings as well.
So have we now definitely established that this bank and the ditch is the outside edge of our precinct?
I was afraid you'd ask me that. No, no, I'm afraid not.
What we thought was the Templar boundary at the bottom of the trench was actually a modern field drain. Excuse me, Carenza, I am right in saying there is evidence of absolutely nothing here at all?
Oh yes, absolutely nothing at all.
I just wanted to get that clear.
Yes, nothing. I mean, it's as empty as it looks.
We seemed to have hit a complete dead end.
Well,
back in the house, tempers are frayed and egos bruised. We finally got round to looking at the tithe map, something we should have done on day one.
Because we should have looked at this.
Well, I said it
right at the start.
I said it when we were at
Well,
Bassett.
I know you did, and you know, and if we'd have seen that, on Friday, we wouldn't have been farting around in the fields out the back. We cross.
What?
Cross with Templecombe. Take me cup away. Because we should have looked at the bloody tithe-free map before, because it's got an enclosure on it of tithe-free land.
That's the chapel in the corner.
That
there,
is Templar
Tony.
property. And this farm is not Templar property.
Jeff's house is here.
But everything west of that line, which includes the present house and all the rest of it, is not in the tithe-free area.
Yeah.
It's land that they didn't pay any tithes on because they were exempt, because they were a monastic order with a lot of privileges granted by the Pope and other people. Right, and that sometimes survives right the way through, and it gets onto the tithe map in the early 19th century. What we missed out was a really very, very early stage of just seeing what the map showed.
This is Jeff's house. Up to now, we'd looked in this field over here, and below his house down here, when we should have been looking at the field over here.
And that's just tumble. There's
that one, yeah.
It's a fallen down wall that you're pulling away there.
So we opened a new trench where we now thought the boundary wall should be.
Well, look, oh, Phil, that's all going straight down there,
Yeah,
isn't it?
all right.
Coming.
Let's see if we can get in here.
There we are. Yeah, you can see that quite clearly, the edge of that. Got some pottery here, Phil.
Yeah?
And some crucial dating evidence.
That's better, isn't it?
Oh, God, that's
Look at
medieval,
that.
isn't it?
Base, isn't it?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, just got a...
Tip just going down
there's
towards
the, yeah, there's the, well, there's the side of the pot, and there's the base of it. Brilliant. What do you reckon then for the date, apart from medieval?
Well, it looks, I mean, that could be 12th century, couldn't it? I don't think there's any
that,
problem
yeah, I
with that.
suppose that is
12th,
really-
13th century, yeah. Ah, Phil.
Well, Phil may have thought it was knocking off time, but Carenza had a different idea. She'd identified a wall in the field next door on the line of the Templar boundary.
Look at it.
It's amazing.
Huge, great big, exactly the same sort of makeup.
Yeah.
It's your classic sort of monastic enclosure wall, tall, thin. Doesn't have to be particularly well made, it's only enclosing it. Look at the height of that. When you look through here, through the gap in this wall, you can see how much higher the ground is that side than this side. This wall's been here for a long, long time for that much ground to have built up against it. Look, you see, you're virtually a metre higher than me.
There is a good old drop, isn't it?
So the Templar wall had been behind the bushes all the time. These foundations suggested that a stone boundary wall about 3 metres high would have stood here. Impressive maybe, but really only for show. Inside the walls would have been living quarters for the knights and their servants. A large monastic farm would have had barns, stables, a brew house and a bakery. But sadly, Jeff's house was well outside this precinct. I know about the big burly knights who fought in tournaments, but what about the other kind, like the Templars? When did they start?
Well, basically, they had come about because of the Crusades. After the success of the First Crusade, and there are pilgrims going out to the Holy Land, they need to be fed and looked after, and they need to be protected. So that's where the holy orders of knights, the Templars and Hospitallers, actually come from.
And they actually looked after people?
Oh, yes. There's quite a lot of evidence that they did actually perform these roles of looking after pilgrims and protecting them. Yeah, there's no doubt about that.
But they would have been from the same kinds of families as the other sort of knights?
Oh, that's right. All knights are aristocratic. It's just these individuals, for their own reasons, have decided to go a slightly different way.
And after the Crusades, what happened to them?
Well, really, after the loss of the Holy Land, their kind of raison d'etre kind of goes. So the Templars are suppressed, at least in France, in the 14th century, but the Hospitallers run on till the 16th century. But after the fall of Jerusalem, their raison d'etre is gone.
By the year 1300, the population was growing and so was trade. England was booming. This is the time of Geoffrey Chaucer, the Longbowmen, and successful wars against the French. But 50 years later, bubonic plague had destroyed that confidence and brought about a social revolution.